Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to invite to the stage Bishop Robert Barron.
Thank you all. Thank you, everybody. Well, we filled the room, didn't we? Pretty good. No, congratulations to all the organizers of this great event. You know, we started it last year, and it was very successful, but now even more so this year. So I love the fact that we're building momentum. It's just good for us Catholics to get together. It lifts us up. And I'm especially glad that we have this topic that we have for the conference, namely beauty. Most of my life, I've been focused on the Word. As a student, as a teacher, as a writer, as an evangelist, a lot of my life's been about the spoken word, the written word. And the Catholic tradition reverences the Word, obviously, the Word of God, and the words of all the great thinkers and poets and theologians and all of that. But we also have reverenced the beautiful. And the beautiful is a means of evangelization. I think it's very important that we claim that part of our tradition. I've railed against, as you know, a dumbed-down Catholicism. I hate it because we're a smart religion, and we dumbed ourselves down. No one told us we had to do it, but we did it, and it's been a pastoral disaster. But we also uglified our tradition. We dropped a lot of the beauty of our tradition and decided somehow that, just flattening things out would be more appealing. Well, on the contrary, we should reclaim the beauty of our tradition. So delighted that that's our topic for today. Can I start? I think Devin is running the slides here. I'd be hopeless. I've tried to do this before. I give a talk, and there we go. He knows how to do it. I'm beginning with this figure depicted appropriately on an icon. That's St. John of Damascus, also called St. John Damascene sometimes. If you read Thomas Aquinas, he cites him all the time. Very pivotal figure, even though not all that well known. Born around the year 675, dies around the year 750 AD. So he spans the 7th and 8th centuries. Well-educated Syrian monk, most famous for his role in the iconoclast controversy. Maybe a little known, but it's a very important moment in the history of the church. The iconoclasts, of course, were those who wanted to break icons, to destroy icons. And they had a certain biblical warrant, don't make graven images, and it was seen as quasi-idolatrous. Keep in mind, too, that right around the time of John of Damascus, Islam is emerging, and Islam has got a very sort of anti-imagery tradition. So the iconoclasts emerged, but they were countered by the iconophiles, those who loved icons, and John of Damascus was their best advocate. Thank God he won, because without John of Damascus, there'd be no Chartres Cathedral. Without John of Damascus, there'd be no Sistine Chapel. Without John of Damascus, there'd be no Sainte Chapelle. There'd be no history of the visual within Catholicism. Mind you, too, move forward several centuries, namely the 16th century, the time of the Reformation, you've got another outbreak of iconoclasm. But a lot of people in this room, myself included, lived through a third, which was a period right after the council, when there was also great destruction, I think, of the beauty of the church. I don't know if you know the work of Malcolm Miller. I think he's still alive. But for decades, he was the dean of tour guides at Chartres Cathedral. I used to take his tours all the time when I was a student in France. But I heard him one time, actually not in France, but in Chicago. He gave a talk. And he said, I reverence the principle, ecclesia semper reformanda, right? The church must always be reformed, and there's always, corruption that needs to be addressed, and all of that. But, he said, the clearest sign that a reform movement has gone bad is when people start destroying beautiful things. And that's always stayed in my mind as dead right. So I stand with the great Catholic tradition that goes back to John of Damascus that loves icons. Now, what was John's argument? It's very interesting, very simple. It was based on St. Paul. Paul refers to Jesus as the icon, in his Greek, the icon of the invisible God. So yes, God is beyond representation. Of course, God's beyond anything that we could create to depict him. Of course he is. However, in the incarnation, God made an icon of himself, namely in the humanity of Jesus. Therefore, it gives a warrant to Christian artists up and down the centuries to participate in this move as we continue the incarnational impulse. It was a good argument in the 8th century. It's still a good argument. If Christ is the icon of the invisible God, we can continue making icons as well. I think I'm a little reluctant to put him up here, but Woody Allen, there he is. The reason I chose that picture, that's my favorite Woody Allen movie. It's called Hannah and Her Sisters. Came out the year I was ordained, 1986. And remember in this film, Woody thinks he has a brain tumor, but then he doesn't, but it throws him into an existential crisis. Of course, no great surprise in Woody Allen movies. But then his character goes on this quest to find meaning, and he goes to church after church. And what that scene was he comes to a Catholic priest and says, I think I might want to become a Catholic. And the priest says, well, what attracted you to Catholicism? And he said, well, first of all, it's such a beautiful religion. And I remember thinking, even as I saw the movie 36 years ago, A, that's right, and B, notice the evangelical power of our beauty. So here in the movie is a religious seeker, and he wasn't attracted by arguments, first of all, wasn't attracted by the liturgy, first of all. He was attracted by the beauty of our tradition. I think it was right in his time. It's still right. If I can go from Woody Allen to another great Jewish figure, namely Cardinal Lustiger of Paris. I wonder how many remember him. Do you? Jean-Marie Lustiger. He was the Archbishop of Paris in the 80s and 90s of the last century. And he was the Archbishop when I was a student in Paris. I'm especially proud, by the way, that he signed my doctoral diploma because he was the Archbishop during that time. But Lustiger was a Jew. His given name was Aaron. And his parents died in the Shoah. And during that awful period, they sent this young kid to a Catholic family to protect him during the Nazi period. And while he's with this Catholic family, he began reading the Bible in its entirety, Old Testament and New. But what really moved him to convert to the Catholic faith was a journey to one of the Gothic churches. And this young Jewish kid walks into it wasn't one of the better known cathedrals, but a Gothic cathedral, and it converted him. Now, I mean, he was a man of words. In fact, one of my favorite memories of my Parisian years was going on Sunday night at 6:30 to Notre Dame in Paris, where Cardinal Lustiger, a master of the French language, would hold forth. The French don't hesitate, by the way, to give 30-minute homilies. Well, I didn't mind when he was preaching. So my point there is he was a man of words, but it was imagery, it was art, it was beauty that moved him to conversion. Another figure here, the great Paul Claudel, the French playwright, one of the greatest French playwrights of the 20th century. Claudel, like a lot of moderns, had kind of wandered away from the faith of his youth into sort of a vague agnosticism. But then one day he finds himself indeed in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Vespers was being sung. And he was looking up at the north rose window, in my judgment, the finest rose window in the world. And at that moment, his faith was awakened. At that moment, he came to believe. It wasn't words, wasn't arguments, it was beauty that converted him. Now look, I'm no Lustiger, I'm no Paul Claudel, but I had a similar experience. And I've written about it, maybe you've read in some of the things I've written. It happened to me June the 12th, 1989. It was the day I arrived in Paris to commence my doctoral studies. And in some ways, it was like the worst day of my life. If you've been through the experience of leaving home and starting something new, how difficult that is. But nothing's more difficult than leaving your country and leaving your own language behind. And I was in this house that French was the only language spoken. This is pre-cell phone. All I had in my wallet was in a little piece of paper, the address of the house. And I got there, I dropped my bags off. I was hungry, I was tired, I was jet lagged. But I knew where Notre Dame was from studying maps of Paris. And so I just made my way down the Boulevard Saint-Michel, and I came to the Ile de la Cité, and there was Notre Dame. I entered, I walked up the main aisle, and I came to the transept, and I turned left, and that's what I saw. That's the North Rose that converted Paul Claudel. Well, I stood there roughly where he stood. They have a marker on the ground there at Notre Dame. It's roughly where he stood. I didn't know Paul Claudel at the time, never even knew the name. But I stood there. Why don't we keep it up there? There we go. I don't know, 20 minutes, half hour. Despite the jet lag, despite everything, I stood there and stared at that window. And no kidding, I went back to that spot every single day. This would be June. I came home at Christmas time. Every single day, I came to that spot and stared at that window. What was going on? Well, in the course of the talk, I might be able to articulate some of it. I didn't know at the time. I just knew it had this sort of mesmeric impact on me. Now, it wasn't conversion. I was a young priest doing my doctoral studies, but it affected some alchemy in me. It did something to my mind and my heart and my soul. That's the power of the beautiful. And I want to, in the course of this talk, kind of explore that. I mean, one way to put it is the extraordinary harmony of that window was placing some kind of harmony in me. But we'll say much more about that. I want to cut to Pope Francis here next. When I was with the California bishops on my ad limina visit, right before COVID hit, we were all there, and we spent 3 hours with him. He just responds to any question you ask. And in the course of that, he said, if you want to know the key to my pontificate, it's Evangelii Gaudium, right? The joy of the gospel, his letter on evangelization. And he told us, this is the way when you're writing church documents you think, it's a combination of Evangelii Nunciandi of Paul VI and Gaudium et Spes, hence the Evangelii Gaudium. And he said, that's the key to everything that I do and say, is how to evangelize. Well, in that document, what do you find? You find his stress on what he called the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty. Now, I'll say something about von Balthasar, who was a big influence on the young Bergoglio. And so I think that's where he got the stress on the beautiful. I think one place you see it with Francis is he's a master of the beautiful gesture, isn't he? From the time he was elected, we saw that. His outreach to, the profoundly deformed man is paying his own bill at the clergy hotel, and his public gestures, I think reminiscent of John Paul II. He had that gift too, didn't he? But the beautiful gesture, the beau geste, as the French say, as a way of evangelization. Now, here's the question as we continue this analysis. So you say, okay, I get it, John of Damascus and the beautiful, and it seems to be part of our tradition, and, Paul Claudel, and, okay, I get all that, but isn't it a little bit vague and ephemeral to talk about the beautiful? I mean, isn't that kind of subjective? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and, who am I to tell you what's beautiful, et cetera, et cetera? Can we get a more substantive sense of it? And here I do want to draw attention to Hans Urs von Balthasar, the favorite theologian of both John Paul II and Benedict XVI. There he is with the two of them. That's good. Henri de Lubac, who was no slouch himself in this regard, referred to Balthasar as the most cultivated man in Europe. At pretty high praise. Looking across all of European culture, he thought Balthasar was the most cultivated person. Well, Balthasar, let me lay a little philosophy on you. Immanuel Kant, the great German philosopher, articulated the move from the true to the good to the beautiful, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, the critique of judgment. He took the three transcendentals, so-called, in that order, from the true to the good to the beautiful. Balthasar very consciously turned that around. So he writes his Herrlichkeit, it means the glory of the Lord. His first move was the beautiful. His second move, he calls it the Theodramatik. That's the good. That's how does finite freedom relate to infinite freedom. And then finally, his third volume is called Theologik, which means theologic, the true. He moved from the beautiful to the good to the true. Now, you say, okay, that's a little bit of, philosophical arcana, but I think it's very important in our culture today. In our postmodern culture, a lot of people are uneasy with claims of truth, aren't they? Truth, your truth, my truth, but there's no real truth. Don't lay your, truth on me. Who are you to tell me what to think? Even more so, if we talk about the good. Here's how you should behave. Well, come on, don't lay your value trip on me. That's just a power move on your part. People are very suspicious of the true and the good. I think Balthasar's instinct was, especially in our world today, beginning with the beautiful is less threatening to people. Fewer hackles go up when you start with the beautiful because all you have to do is say, look, just look at this thing. Show someone the North Rose window. Bring them into Chartres Cathedral. Show them Dante's Divine Comedy. Just look at. Is that a better way, perhaps, to evangelize, to begin with the beautiful and then to move toward the good and the true? I know a lot of Detroiters here, right? As you probably know, I've got a strong Detroit connection. As a little kid, I lived in Birmingham and Troy, and my first baseball team was the Tigers, and I was there for the 1968 World Series, right? So that's the first baseball team that I really have in my mind. And the first game that my father took me and my brother, who's here, there he is, the first game he took me to was in 1967 at the old Tiger Stadium. Some Detroiters remember that? The old Tiger Stadium. And I was 7 years old, and it's a long time ago, but I remember it vividly, coming up out of the kind of bowels of the stadium, and then you suddenly see the bright green, it was a night game, so the lights, the bright green field, and the Tigers with their white uniforms. And I don't remember the details of the game, but I remember the experience of the game. Well, I started playing Little League right after that. It was the beauty of that experience. It was the beauty of the game that led me to want to play the game. I moved from the beautiful to the good, and then I played baseball for many years. I was pretty good as a kid. I played for many years. And having played, I then came to understand baseball from the inside, right? I understood the rules and why they existed, etc. From the beautiful to the good to the true. If you're teaching a kid baseball, I would suggest that's not a bad way to do it. What wouldn't you do if you're teaching a kid baseball? Brand new, never played before. All right, let's begin with the infield fly rule. Well, no, I mean, baseball people know the infield fly rule is cool. I'm glad there is an infield fly rule. It makes perfect sense, But you don't start with that. You'd start with, look at the field. You maybe would show them a professional game. Look at how that guy runs. Look at how he made that catch. Look at how that hitter gets the full extension through the ball, and show them the game. And then chances are they're going to want to play the game. And then having played for a while, they're going to understand the truth of it from the inside. Well, can I suggest to you that might be a good way to think about evangelization? If we're evangelizing, how shouldn't we begin? With rules. Rules are great. I mean, precious things in life we surround by rules. Right? That's a basic thing. If something is worth nothing to us, we have no rules about it. Can I pick up that rock in the alley? Well, yeah, who cares? There's no rule about that. But, can I take the Mona Lisa off the wall, please, and bring it home? Well, no, if something is precious to us, we surround it with rules, right? So I get it. But beginning with how splendid something is, and then drawing someone into the playing of the game, then they get the truth, the rules from the inside. So that's, I think, might be a path evangelically. I'll just give you one more example. I think we got some pictures from Brideshead Revisited, which is, I think, there we go. I think the greatest Catholic novel of the 20th century. And I remember watching it as a young guy, that wonderful PBS series. There's the young, Jeremy Irons, right, on the right, playing Charles Ryder, but Laurence Olivier's in that, and John Gielgud is the cream of, and Claire Bloom, these great Shakespearean actors are in it. And it's a beautiful representation of the novel. So get it. Revisit Brideshead Revisited, maybe. But better yet, read the book. But the reason I bring it up is Brideshead, the manor house you can see there. Evelyn Waugh, the Catholic author of this novel, I think wants us to see that as the church. So Brideshead, the sense of the church as the virgin bride of Christ, Christ who's head of his bride, the church, all of that. So Brideshead is the church. What first attracts Charles there on the right? Charles is a cool agnostic as the story begins, like a lot of people today. What first attracts him is the beauty of Brideshead. So he's an artist, he's a painter, and he goes into that manor house and he's just overwhelmed by the architectural beauty, by the paintings within it. It's overwhelming to him. Then in the course of the novel, it's a complex story, but in the course of the novel, he begins to feel the moral demand that's coming from living in that house. And then finally, at the very end of the story, he comes to appreciate the truth that's embodied within the house. It's the journey into the church, beginning with the beautiful, leading to the good, and finally coming to the true. I think it's that same Balthazar rhythm, the reversal of our usual instinct, beginning with truth or with rules, maybe begin with the winsome attractiveness, the splendor of the church as a way in. I want to quote this lovely line. At one point, Charles is at the house, and Sebastian, his friend, who's a practicing Catholic, comes back from Mass. And Charles begins to ask him some curious questions about religion. And Sebastian's like, oh, come on, don't bore me. He doesn't want to talk about it. But Charles keeps pressing him. And Sebastian says how lovely the story of Christmas is. And Charles says, well, you can't believe something just because it's a lovely idea. And Sebastian says, but I do. That's how I believe. And it's sort of a tossed off line in the story, but it's very telling. That's how I believe. I'm drawn into the truth through the beautiful. Okay, so you're still with me and you're saying, all right, I get that, but I'm still struggling with what does it mean to call something beautiful? Is there something objective about it, or are we just still in kind of a subjective realm? Well, can I draw attention here to Dietrich von Hildebrand, who's one of the great, that's the very young von Hildebrand, one of the great Catholic philosophers of the 20th century. Both John Paul II and Benedict XVI were deeply enamored of his thought. And he makes a distinction that, by the way, Hildebrand, to his infinite credit, was one of Hitler's #1 enemies. So he was editing a journal in Austria during the 30s, and was a fiercely anti-Nazi. One of the people that saw very early on that there was something seriously the matter with Hitler and Nazism. So he was so outspoken that Hitler had him like on his enemies list, #1. And von Hildebrand barely got out of the country after the Anschluss and all that. Barely got out of the country, eventually ended up here and taught at Fordham in New York. I had the great privilege, I never, of course, met him, he died in the 70s, but I met a couple of his students who were deeply impacted by him and then had an impact on me. But here's a distinction he makes. It's very simple, but it's helpful, it's telling. Between what he calls the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. Let me let that just sink in. So the merely subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. So what's that? His example he uses a lot is a baseless compliment is merely subjectively satisfying. So someone pays you a compliment, but you know it's false. You know that you don't deserve that compliment. It's subjectively satisfying. It might flatter you, but it has no objective value. Mine is, I'm a big fan of spaghetti and meatballs. I have the culinary taste of an 8-year-old, basically. It's really true. People say, you studied in France? Yeah, I know. I never liked French food that much. But anyway, I find it subjectively satisfying. That's my point. I find spaghetti meatballs subjectively satisfying. It would never occur to me in a million years to become an evangelist for spaghetti and meatballs. Like, I want all of you to be, of course not. I realize that's a subjective matter of my private taste, right? But the objectively valuable, and I trust now as I start describing this, you'll know what I'm talking about. When something's objectively valuable, it's not received by your subjectivity or corralled by your subjective expectations. Rather, it breaks through. It shatters your receptivity. It rearranges your subjectivity. It makes you think about the world in a different way. You're not corralling it, it's corralling you. You know what I'm talking about? I don't have a picture of her, but one of my heroes, Iris Murdoch, the wonderful Irish novelist and philosopher, she talked about the objectivity of the French language. And I get this, having studied languages. You know, when you're studying a language and you're just struggling with it, like, it doesn't make any sense, or I can't get my mind around that, or why do they say it that way? And I remember I had a professor years ago, and I said, well, that's just not logical. He said, c'est le français. It's French. French is not there to please you. That's the point. It's there in all of its objective integrity and beauty, and it's meant to rearrange you. My secretary in Santa Barbara, a good friend, Sylvia Morgan, and Sylvia's from Argentina. And so she was also a Spanish tutor for me. And anyone there's Spanish speakers here, but people have studied Spanish. The ser estar distinction is deeply annoying to Anglophones. You know what I mean? That's the verb to be. But there are two ways to do it in Spanish, and it's like massively confusing which one you should use. And so regularly with Sylvia, I would complain about that. I'd say, for Pete's sake, why can't the King of Spain just come get a little committee together and say we're going to have it ser or a star? It's one of the two. And she'd always give me this look like, when are you going to grow up, you know? And look, it's the Spanish language, pal. It's not there to satisfy you. There's something objectively integral about it. Or like if you will hear from Liz Lev about the Sistine Chapel. If you walked in the Sistine Chapel, looked up, and you said, I don't like it. Well, see, that's exactly the right reaction, because you're treating it as something that's either subjectively satisfying or not. Yeah, I'm not really into that. Well, see, that's a judgment on you, not on the Sistine ceiling, right? That's telling you that your subjectivity is off kilter. Or you listen to Beethoven's 7th Symphony, and you go like, it's all right. Well, that's just completely inappropriate. The objectively valuable changes you. Now, my example, to go from the Sistine Chapel and Beethoven to my rock and roll hero, Bob Dylan. Do we have Bob Dylan coming up? Yeah. Now I'm from his state, by the way, his home state of Minnesota. I visited Hibbing, his hometown, a couple months ago. The Minnesota people? God bless you. Anyway, Rolling Stone magazine, which I've been reading since I was 18, it's in decline now, I'll tell you the truth. It used to be much better, but they had a cover story many years ago, and it was, what's the first song that rocked your world? And they asked a group of rock stars themselves, name the first song that rocked your world. And it was a good question, and I got it right away what that meant. They did not ask, what's the first song you liked? What's the first song that rocked you, that changed you? Well, see, I knew exactly how I would answer that, because the first song I remember liking was Sugar, Sugar by the Archies. Do you remember? these are the old folks like me remember. You know, Sugar Sugar is a really catchy song, and if it comes on the radio today, I turn the radio up and listen to it. I like that song, but it didn't rock my world. You know, it's a silly little ditty. But the first song that rocked my world was Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, that I listened to for the first time probably when I was in college. And I listened to it over and over and over again. And it's, in one way, a simple song. It maybe 4 or 5 chords. It doesn't have a bridge. It's not like a complicated song. But it's a song that rearranged my consciousness. It rearranged my thinking. It made me look at life in a different way. Do you know Patti Smith, the rocker, had a very similar experience with that same song. She said she was in college. I don't know what age she was, but she heard it for the first time, and she said she pulled over to the side of the road, got out of the car, sat on the curb, and just tried to take it in. Well, see, Sugar Sugar won't do that to you, but a song like a Rolling Stone will do that to you. See, and that's von Hildebrand's distinction, I think, between the subjectively satisfying and the objectively valuable. Can I suggest to you that the truly beautiful is like that? See, it's not superficial decoration. Oh, isn't that nice? What a nice song, or what a pretty picture, or oh, look at... No, the truly beautiful knocks you down. Baltzar says it elects you. First, it stops you. You know, we talk about aesthetic arrest. That's Patti Smith, by the way, getting out of the car and just sitting on the curb. That was aesthetic arrest. You're stopped by the beautiful. But then Baltzar says it elects you, it chooses you, and then it sends you. Like what I'm doing right now, many, many, many years later, I'm telling you about this experience of hearing that song. I was arrested, I was elected, and I was sent on mission. That should start sounding familiar now with the one we think is the most beautiful imaginable, right? But we'll get there. Okay, let's go now from Balthasar to von Hildebrand, now to my intellectual hero, St. Thomas Aquinas, who says some very interesting things about the beautiful. His first is there he is, quod visum placet, in his very pithy Latin. The beautiful is quod visum placet, that which having been seen pleases. Cool, it's a cool definition, you know, pithy. That which having been seen pleases. Think of me at the North Rose window, Paul Claudel with the same window. That which having been seen pleases. But now, what are you seeing? What's the visum? And his famous answer, you see it up there in his Latin and in the English. The beautiful occurs, Thomas says, at the intersection of integritas, consonantia, and claritas. And I'm rendering them, that's James Joyce's rendering, by the way. Wholeness, harmony, and radiance. When those three things come together, we say, that's beautiful. So integritas means wholeness, that it hangs together as one. Do you know when something's kind of at war with itself, whether it's a painting or it's a golf swing? You know, why do we all have bad golf swings? You can tell in an instant when it's an amateur swing. In an instant you can tell, because it's at war with itself. It's not about one thing. By the way, Kierkegaard, the philosopher, said a saint is someone whose life is about one thing. It's a wonderful definition. It has integritas. It holds together. Secondly, consonantia. That means all the elements that make it up are harmonious, consonare, to sound with. Think of our Sistine Chapel choir today. When you hear those many voices, the many voices blending clearly into one song, into one that had integritas, that had consonantia, right? Again, think of a golf swing, all the elements that make it up. And when you see like a Rory McIlroy or something like that swing, it's gorgeous to watch. And if you're a golfer, you're admiring, oh boy, hit that thing a mile. But the aesthetic quality, like a slow motion of a golf swing, there's hardly anything in sports more beautiful than a really well-executed, harmonious golf swing. It's got integritas consonantia. And then the final one, claritas. In some texts of Aquinas, indeed, he says claritas refers to brightness of color. And that's true. I think when something's really colorful and bright, it catches our eye and we find it pleasing. But, if that's the case, then most of Rembrandt's paintings wouldn't be beautiful, right? The things that are somber in color. So what Thomas usually means by claritas is not bright color. What he means is the radiance of form. It's when the form of something becomes radiant. When you say like, now that's a golf swing, that's what it's supposed to look like. That's it. It becomes radiant, it shines. When those three things come together, you have the beautiful. Now, I'm going to give another kind of silly example here. Do you remember do we have it? Yeah, there we go. Do you remember John Madden, the commentator? He just died, didn't he, John Madden? Or is he still alive? Anyway, for years and years, John Madden, he used to be the coach of the Oakland Raiders, right? And then he becomes a really popular football announcer. And Madden loved the tough, down in the trenches players. He didn't like the fancy schmancy wide receivers and quarterbacks. He liked the down in the front lines, the trenches. And so I was watching a game one time with him, and the play had ended, and the camera was kind of scanning the sidelines, and it caught, not this very guy, but a guy like that. It caught this guy, and he was standing like this, and he had the black stuff under his eyes, and his jersey was ripped, and his hair is all sweaty, and he's standing like this, and Madden goes, there's a beauty, And I remember thinking, I doubt, had read a lot of Thomas Aquinas, but you got it, is what he saw in that player, integritas. Like he was about one thing. He was about one thing. And then he looked at all the elements that made him up and found them harmonious. And then the form became radiant to him. Like, yeah, that's it. That's what a football player ought to look like. This occurred to me with Father Paul Murray here from the north of Ireland, and again with golf in mind. Any golf fans watch David Faherty, the commentator from Northern Ireland? Everything he says goes up at the end, And he was, this is a few years ago, he was commenting on a game, and Craig Stadler, do you remember that name? Called the Walrus, right? Because he was a big, heavy guy, and he had stringy hair and this big kind of walrus mustache. And, not someone you'd say is a classic, beauty, but he's striding across the green, and David Faherty goes, he's a thing of beauty. I think he was just playing ironically on integritas, consonantia, and claritas. See, I think here too, everybody, beauty is subjective. No, it's not. It's as objective as the true and the good. If we're tempted to say, all value, moral value is just relative. No, it's not. The whole society falls apart if we hold that. Or you say, as people today sadly are saying, all truth is relative and culturally determined and just plays of power. Well, God help us. God help us, then we can't say anything true anymore. So just as the true and the good are objective, so is the beautiful objective. And God help us, the Catholic Church right now in the Western world is one of the last great defenders, I think, of the objectivity of the true and the good and the beautiful. So don't let them bully us. I mean, there's a bullying going on in the culture big time, and they're completely caught on the horns of a dilemma. Because the minute you say, hey, there is no objective truth, well, at least you think that's objectively true, don't you? So the whole thing is ridiculous, and we should stand with our great tradition. Okay, let's do a couple more things with you. So now we've been trying to fill out the picture of what makes the beautiful beautiful, but now I want to make this move toward the link between the particular beautiful thing and the source of beauty. And my first stopping point is with Plato and this marvelous dialogue, the Symposium, which we probably all read in Philosophy 101, this dialogue on the nature of love. But
the most famous speech in it is given by a woman named Diotima. And she's talking about the progress by which we move from our appreciation of the particular beautiful toward the source of beauty itself. And I'm just going to read you some passages from her famous speech, just to give you the idea. She says, first of all, if his teacher instructs him as he should, he here is like a student, is somebody he's trying to train. He will fall in love with the beauty of one individual body. So it's someone falling in love with the beauty of one individual body. But then, next he must consider how nearly related the beauty of any one body is to the beauty of any other. And then he must grasp that the beauties of the body are as nothing compared to the beauties of the soul. So now we move from one level of beauty to another. And from this, he'll be led to contemplate the beauty of laws and institutions. So now we go beyond the human realm into this more abstract form of beauty. Next, his attention should be diverted from institutions to the sciences, so that he may know the beauty of every kind of knowledge. Here's that moment when, it's wonderful, when you begin to understand philosophy and history and science, and the beauty of these disciplines opens up to you. And finally, turning his eye toward the open sea of beauty, he will find in such contemplation the seed of the most fruitful discourse and the loftiest thought. So I'm just giving you a couple little passages there from the Diotima speech. But look how it moves. From a very particular beautiful thing, then to ever wider horizons of the beautiful. Until, now watch this metaphor because it's going to be repeated a lot in the tradition. Turning his eyes toward the open sea of beauty. That means the infinite source of the beautiful itself. Did this speech have an impact on the Western tradition? Yeah, big time. And I'm going to give you just two famous examples of it. This Platonic move is mimicked many centuries later by the great Dante. With Aquinas, probably the great mastermind of our tradition. Dante, even though it's a little bit foggy how much is true and how much is poetic elaboration, but it seems pretty clear that when he was a very young kid, he spied this girl, just a year younger than he, named Beatrice, and he was immediately, absolutely, completely in love with her. 9 years went by without his really seeing or speaking to her. And then he has that famous experience crossing the Arno in Florence. He spies Beatrice, and this time she gazes at him and even exchanges a few words with him. But it's enough utterly to change his life. Her beauty was such that he began living a new life. And he writes this famous poem called La Vita Nuova, the new life that was opened up to him by this beautiful girl. And at the conclusion of that, he says, I will write a poem to her more beautiful than any poem ever written. Well, by God, he did. It's called the Divine Comedy, in which she plays a key role, Beatrice, right? Which is what? To lead him finally to the vision of God. Well, we go right from the Diotima speech of Plato right to Dante, and there's a straight line. Is this particular beautiful who leads him by steady steps to the beautiful itself, the source of beauty. I'll give you one more example. Now, fast forward almost to our own time. The great James Joyce. What can you say about James Joyce? It hasn't been said, but a Catholic in many ways to his bones, even though he repudiates the church and announces his hostility to it. But I don't think you can read anything of Joyce without seeing Catholicism all over the place. But one of the most famous examples is in his portrait of the artist as a young man, his autobiographical novel, when he was like around that age. It's about many things, that book, but there's a famous scene, and it reflects a real event in Joyce's life when he actually saw the woman who'd become his wife for the first time. But in light of everything I've been telling you, and I'm going to close with this, don't worry, I won't go on much longer. In light of everything I've been saying, see what's going on here. So Joyce is walking on the Strand, he always calls it, the beach in Dublin, and he's struggling, with what to do with his life and what's it all about, and he thought he might want to be a priest, but now that's over, and he's wondering what to do. And then suddenly this. A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. Joyce, who read everything, right away, we're thinking the Diotima speech is turning toward the open sea of the beautiful itself. So a girl stood before him, alone and still, gazing out to sea. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird. Her long, slender legs were delicate as a crane's and pure, save where an emerald trail of seaweed had fashioned itself as a sign upon the flesh. Her slate blue skirts were kilted boldly about her waist and dovetailed behind her. Her bosom was as a bird, soft and slight and soft as the breast of some dark plumaged dove. But her long, fair hair was girlish and touched with the wonder of mortal beauty, her face. Well, now notice something here, and Joyce is very clear about this earlier in the book. He's a student of scholastic philosophy, and he had spent time in this very book explaining integritas, consonantia, and claritas to one of his friends. Well, what do you see? A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. Integritas. He's isolated her. He's seen her as whole. And what I've read to you, it's a little bit of the passage, is the consonantia of all the elements that make up this beautiful girl. And then this. She was alone and still, gazing out to sea. So again, lest we miss the Diotima, he says it again. And when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. This is beautiful. It's very much like von Hildebrand. Joyce distinguishes between the pornographic gaze, which is a gaze that wants to possess. It's the gaze that wants subjective satisfaction, as opposed to this gaze, which is a worshipful gaze. It doesn't want to dominate the one that's seen, but it is drawn by the power of what's seen into something greater. It's exactly this distinction. The first faint noise of gently moving water broke the silence, low and faint and whispering, faint as the bells of sleep, hither and thither, and a faint flame trembled on her cheek. And then here's how the passage ends. "O heavenly God," cried Stephen's soul in an outburst of joy. Well, see, that's how it works, isn't it? Is the beautiful particular leads by steady steps, if we allow its power to work on us, to the very source of beauty. In Joyce's example here, "O heavenly God," in a burst of joy. From Diotima through Dante to James Joyce, it's the same move. And I would argue that's a deeply Catholic instinct, that the particular beautiful window or cathedral or ceiling or painting or sculpture can lead us to this moment, "O heavenly God." Hey, Devin, can we just go, and I'll close with this, to the rose window again? I want to just meditate a bit more on that. Can we get the north rose up there again? At the very center of the rose, this is true of all the great roses, is always Christ. So you see it's his mother, it's Notre Dame Cathedral after all, but on her lap is the Christ child. Christ is the center. And then the window is organized in ordered harmonies around that center, and then all of it connected by spokes to the center. Well, can we show the big picture again, Devin? To get the whole thing. There we go. You see how the harmonic arrangement is such that all the parts relate to every other part, and all of them are drawn toward the center. Can you see, and by the way, this is being built right when Thomas Aquinas is in Paris writing about integritas, consonantia, and claritas. I can't help but think there's no better exemplification of it. The window is one, right? It hangs together as one. It has integritas, wholeness. And then the consonantia of the parts. And then if you want claritas, radiance, the light pouring through that window, the splendor of form, it's all there. But see, what that's meant to be is a picture of the well-ordered soul. If Christ is the center of your life, then all the elements that make you up will tend to find their place harmoniously around that center. So think of, the French call those medallions, each of the things. Think of all those as representative of parts of your life. It's your private life, your public life, your emotions, your intellect, your friendships, everything. Are they all connected to Christ? Then they will tend to fall into a harmonic relationship around him. Here's something else that you might not be able to see too clearly, but right around the central window, there are 8 little circles. You see them? Now go the next row out. It's twice 8, 16. Next row out, it's twice 16, 32, and then another row of 32. Add together 32, 32, 16, and 8, and you will get, I will tell you, 88. So the north rows is a meditation on the number 8, which stands for eternity, because it stands outside the 7, which is the completed cycle of time, the 7 days of the week. That's why we speak of the octave of Christmas or the octave of Easter, right? The eternal dimension. And then the spinning of the wheel, the circle, is evocative of a perfect shape. Therefore, it's a meditation on what your soul should look like. If it's centered on Christ, it'll be as beautiful as that. And it's also an anticipation of the, oh, heavenly God, how that beautiful thing leads you by steady steps to the very source of the beautiful that we'll look at forever in eternity. Isn't it wonderful, by the way, that the beatific vision is offered to us as the image of heaven? It's looking at something. Quod visum placet, that which having been seen pleases. Beautiful things here below ultimately are anticipations of the beauty we'll see forever in heaven. And that's why it matters so much in our Catholic tradition. Listen, blessings, everybody. Thanks for listening tonight.